The sound of that RPG cutting through the air still echoes in my head 15 years later. I can close my eyes right now and feel the heat of that Afghan sun beating down on my face, taste the dust in my mouth, and hear the chaos that erupted around me in what should have been just another routine patrol. But there was nothing routine about what happened on that scorching July morning in Helmand province. Nothing routine about finding myself completely alone, cut off from my unit, with insurgents closing in from every direction and only 3 magazines left in my vest. I was 22 years old then, fresh out of basic training and convinced I knew everything about being a soldier. I'd read every manual, aced every test, and spent countless hours on the firing range back at Fort Bragg. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for those 6 hours that would change everything I thought I knew about fear, survival, and what it really means to fight for your life. The morning started like any other at Forward Operating Base Dwyer. The sun was already brutal at 0600 hours, and the air conditioning in our tent had given up the ghost 2 days earlier. I remember lying on my cot, staring at the canvas ceiling and thinking about home. About my mom's pancakes on Sunday mornings, about my girlfriend Sarah and the promise ring I'd given her before deployment, about how I was going to use my combat pay to finally buy that Mustang I'd been dreaming about since high school. My squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, was already up and moving around the tent, his boots making that familiar thudding sound on the plywood floor. Martinez was a good man, a career soldier with 2 previous deployments under his belt. He had this way of making even the most dangerous missions feel manageable, like we were just going out for a walk in the neighborhood instead of patrolling one of the most volatile regions in Afghanistan. "Rise and shine, ladies," Martinez called out in his gravelly voice. "We've got a village to visit today, and the locals are expecting us to bring our winning personalities." The other guys in my squad started stirring. There was Johnson, our medic, who could patch up anything from a scraped knee to a sucking chest wound, and somehow always had a joke ready to lighten the mood. Thompson, our machine gunner, who carried that M240 like it weighed nothing and could put rounds on target from distances that seemed impossible. And Rodriguez, our radio operator, who had this uncanny ability to maintain communications even when everything around us was falling apart. We'd been together for 4 months by then, long enough to develop that unspoken trust that keeps soldiers alive in combat zones. We knew each other's habits, each other's strengths and weaknesses. When Johnson reached for his left pocket, we knew he was nervous. When Thompson started humming under his breath, we knew he was ready for anything. When Rodriguez adjusted his headset for the 3rd time, we knew the radio chatter was getting heavy. The briefing that morning was standard. Intelligence suggested minimal enemy activity in the area we were patrolling. The village of Marja had been relatively quiet for the past 2 weeks, and our mission was simple: show presence, interact with locals, gather any intelligence we could, and return to base before the afternoon heat became unbearable. Easy day, or so we thought. I remember checking my gear that morning with extra care. Something felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way the wind was blowing from the north instead of the east. Maybe it was how quiet the base seemed, even for early morning. Or maybe it was just that feeling you get sometimes, that little voice in the back of your head telling you to pay attention because something's about to change. My M4 was clean and ready with a fresh coat of oil on the bolt carrier. I had 7 magazines loaded with 30 rounds each, plus 1 in the weapon. 2 fragmentation grenades hung from my vest, along with my first aid kit, water bottles and radio. The ceramic plates in my body armor felt heavier than usual, but I told myself it was just the anticipation of another long day in the heat. The Humvee ride to our patrol area took about 20 minutes, winding through terrain that looked like something from another planet. Barren hills stretched in every direction, broken up by the occasional mud brick compound or dried-up riverbed. The landscape was beautiful in its own harsh way, but it was also unforgiving. This was a place where people had been fighting for thousands of years, where every rock and ridge could hide an enemy, where survival meant being smarter, faster, and more determined than whoever wanted you dead. As we approached the village, everything seemed normal. Children played in the dusty streets, women carried water jugs on their heads, and old men sat in the shade of doorways, watching us with expressions that gave nothing away. The Afghan people had learned long ago to be cautious around foreign soldiers, regardless of which army they belonged to or what flag they flew. We dismounted about 200 meters from the village center and began our patrol on foot. The plan was simple: split into 2 teams, sweep through the main streets, check in with the village elder, and rendezvous back at the vehicles in 2 hours. Martinez would take Johnson and Thompson to the north side of the village, while Rodriguez and I would cover the south side and the market area. That's when everything went wrong. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Rodriguez spotted movement in one of the compounds ahead of us. A figure in dark clothing had ducked behind a wall just as we came around a corner. It could have been nothing, just a civilian who didn't want to deal with American soldiers that day. But Rodriguez had good instincts, and when he pointed toward the compound and whispered possible hostile, I knew we had to check it out. I told Rodriguez to maintain position and watch our 6 while I moved closer to investigate. It was a decision that probably saved his life and nearly cost me mine. As I approached the compound wall, I could hear voices speaking in Dari, the local language. The tone was urgent, hushed, like people making plans they didn't want overheard. I keyed my radio to report what I was hearing, but all I got back was static. The mountains around us were notorious for interfering with communications, and it wasn't unusual to lose contact for short periods. I figured I'd check out the compound quickly and then rejoin Rodriguez to continue our patrol. The compound had a narrow alley running along its eastern wall, barely wide enough for one person to walk through. I could hear the voices more clearly from there, and while I couldn't understand the words, the urgency in their tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. These weren't farmers discussing the weather or merchants haggling over prices. These were men making plans, and something told me those plans involved us. I was about halfway down the alley when the first shot rang out. The bullet cracked past my head so close I could feel the displacement of air against my cheek. Training kicked in immediately, and I dropped to one knee, bringing my rifle up to the ready position. But before I could identify the source of the fire, the world exploded around me. The RPG hit the wall about 10 feet to my left, sending chunks of mud, brick, and mortar flying in every direction. The concussion knocked me sideways, and for a moment I couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in my ears. Dust and debris filled the air, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. More shots rang out, the distinctive crack of AK-47s echoing off the compound walls. I could hear shouting in Dari, voices calling back and forth as the insurgents coordinated their attack. They had us right where they wanted us, caught in a narrow alley with limited cover and no easy way out. I tried my radio again, desperately hoping to reach Rodriguez or Martinez, but the static was even worse now. Either the explosion had damaged my equipment, or the enemy was jamming our frequencies. Either way, I was on my own. The shooting intensified, and I realized this wasn't just a chance encounter with a lone gunman. This was a coordinated ambush, probably planned for days or even weeks. They'd been waiting for us, studying our patrol patterns, learning our habits, and choosing the perfect spot to spring their trap. I pressed myself against the compound wall, trying to make myself as small a target as possible while I assessed the situation. The alley stretched about 50 meters in front of me, before opening into what looked like a small courtyard. Behind me, the way I'd come was now blocked by rubble from the RPG explosion. To my left was the compound wall, solid mud brick about 8 feet high. To my right was another wall, slightly lower, but topped with broken glass that glinted in the harsh sunlight. The voices were getting closer, and I could hear footsteps moving through the debris. They were coming for me, probably thinking the explosion had killed or wounded me badly enough that I wouldn't be able to fight back. They were about to learn otherwise. I checked my rifle quickly, making sure the barrel wasn't obstructed and that I still had a full magazine. 29 rounds left in the weapon, plus 6 more magazines in my vest. It would have to be enough. The first insurgent appeared at the mouth of the alley, moving cautiously, but not cautiously enough. He was young, maybe 18 or 19, with a scraggly beard and an AK-47 that looked older than he was. For a split second, our eyes met, and I saw the same surprise in his face that I felt in my chest. Neither of us had expected this moment, this instant where everything would change forever. I squeezed the trigger twice, center mass, just like I'd been trained. The young insurgent dropped immediately, his rifle clattering against the stone ground. I felt nothing in that moment except the need to survive. There was no time for emotion, no time to process what I'd just done. More voices were shouting now, and I could hear boots running across rooftops above me. I moved quickly to the fallen fighter's position, grabbing his AK-47 and the 2 magazines he had strapped to his chest. Extra ammunition was extra life in a situation like this. The weapon was old but well maintained, and I could tell from the wear patterns that it had seen plenty of use. This wasn't some farmer who'd picked up a rifle to defend his village. This was an experienced fighter, part of a larger group that had been planning this ambush for weeks. The courtyard ahead offered better cover than the narrow alley, but getting there meant crossing about 20 meters of open ground. I could hear movement all around me now, insurgents positioning themselves on rooftops and behind walls. They had the high ground and the numbers, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought I was just another American soldier, predictable and easy to corner. They didn't know that I'd grown up hunting in the woods of North Carolina, that I'd spent countless hours learning to move silently through terrain much more challenging than this desert village. I waited for the next burst of gunfire, then sprinted across the open space, using the sound of their own weapons to mask my movement. Bullets kicked up dust all around me, but I made it to a low wall that offered decent protection. From this new position, I could see 3 insurgents on the rooftop to my north, 2 more moving through a doorway about 40 meters to my east, and at least 1 sniper somewhere in the buildings beyond the courtyard. My radio crackled with static, and for just a moment I thought I heard Rodriguez's voice calling my name. But the transmission was too broken to understand, and I couldn't risk exposing my position by responding. For all I knew, the enemy was monitoring our frequencies and using our own communications against us. The heat was becoming a factor now. It had to be over 110 degrees, and the sun was climbing higher every minute. Sweat was pouring down my face, stinging my eyes and making it difficult to maintain a clear sight picture through my rifle scope. My water was already running low, and I knew that dehydration would become as dangerous as enemy bullets if this firefight dragged on much longer. I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the distinctive whistle of another incoming RPG. I rolled left, just as the rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the wall where I'd been hiding, showering me with debris and filling my mouth with the taste of cordite and pulverized concrete. My ears were ringing again, but I forced myself to keep moving, to stay ahead of their targeting solutions. The explosion had created a new breach in the compound wall, and I could see insurgents moving to flank my position. They were good, disciplined fighters who understood small unit tactics. This wasn't some ragtag militia throwing lead downrange and hoping for the best. These men had been trained, probably by foreign advisors, who'd brought years of combat experience from other conflicts around the world. I engaged the flanking element first, putting controlled pairs into the 2 fighters who were trying to work their way around my left side. Both dropped, but their sacrifice had bought time for the others to reposition. I was now taking fire from at least 5 different directions, and my ammunition was starting to run low. The captured AK-47 jammed after just 3 rounds, probably due to sand in the action, so I tossed it aside and went back to my M4. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. One of the insurgents I'd just engaged was wearing a radio headset, and he'd been speaking into it right before I shot him. They weren't just coordinating among themselves, they were talking to someone else, probably a larger force that was moving to surround the entire area. If I didn't find a way out of this compound soon, I'd be facing a lot more than just the handful of fighters I could see. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to fight my way out through the courtyard, which was exactly what they expected me to do, I went back toward the alley where this whole nightmare had started. The rubble from the first RPG explosion had created a pile of debris that reached almost to the top of the compound wall. If I could climb it without being seen, I might be able to get onto the roof and change the dynamics of this fight. The climb was harder than it looked. The broken concrete and mud brick shifted under my weight, and twice I nearly lost my footing and tumbled back down. But desperation gave me strength I didn't know I had, and after what felt like an eternity, I hauled myself over the wall and onto the flat roof of the compound. From up there, I could see the entire tactical situation laid out below me. There were at least 12 insurgents that I could count, positioned in a rough circle around the compound where they thought I was still trapped. 2 more fighters were moving up the main street, probably the advance element of a larger force. In the distance, I could see dust clouds that suggested vehicles approaching fast. But I also saw something else, a route of escape that would take me through a series of connected rooftops toward the edge of the village. It was risky, and it would mean abandoning any hope of linking up with Rodriguez or the rest of my squad, but it was better than staying put and waiting to be overrun. I started moving across the rooftops, staying low, and using the various obstacles and equipment scattered around to break up my silhouette. Most of these buildings had water tanks, satellite dishes, or clotheslines that provided some concealment. The key was to move slowly and deliberately, resisting the urge to rush, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. Halfway across the second roof, I heard shouting from below. They'd figured out that I wasn't in the compound anymore, and now they were searching for me. I could hear doors being kicked in, furniture being overturned, and the angry voices of men who'd just realized their prey had escaped the trap. I made it to the edge of the village before they spotted me. A fighter on a rooftop about 100 meters away caught sight of my movement and opened fire with his AK-47. The range was too great for accurate shooting with that weapon, but the muzzle flashes gave away my position to every other insurgent in the area. Now it was a race. I had maybe a 2-minute head start before they could organize a pursuit, and the terrain ahead offered both opportunities and dangers. There were several dried creek beds that would provide concealment, but could also become death traps if they managed to get ahead of me. There were rocky outcroppings that offered good defensive positions, but would also slow down my movement. I chose speed over security and ran for the largest wadi, a dry riverbed that cut through the landscape like a scar. The banks were steep enough to provide cover from direct fire, and the bottom was sandy enough to muffle the sound of my footsteps. If I could follow it far enough, it might lead me back toward the area where we'd left our vehicles. The wadi was like running through an oven. The sun was directly overhead now, and the temperature had to be approaching 120 degrees. The sand reflected heat back up at me, creating a furnace effect that made every breath feel like I was inhaling fire. My water was gone, and I could feel the early stages of heat exhaustion setting in, dizziness, nausea, and a headache that felt like someone was driving nails into my skull. But I kept moving because stopping meant dying. I could hear vehicles now, probably pickup trucks loaded with fighters who were trying to cut off my escape route. The sound of engines echoed off the wadi walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were or which direction they were heading. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I reached a point where the wadi branched into 3 smaller channels. I had to make a choice, and I had no way of knowing which path would lead to safety and which would lead to another ambush. The middle channel looked the most promising, angling back toward where I thought our patrol area had been, but it was also the most obvious choice. I went left instead, following a narrower channel that curved away from the village and into more broken terrain. It was a gamble, but everything about this day had been a gamble from the moment that first shot rang out. At least this way, if I was wrong, I'd die on my own terms instead of walking into another trap. The channel led me into a maze of rocky hills and dried-up tributaries. The landscape was even more desolate here, if that was possible. Nothing grew except for the occasional thorn bush, and the only signs of life were the circling vultures that seemed to sense an opportunity. The silence was almost complete, except for the whisper of wind across stone and the distant sound of engines that seemed to be moving away from my position. I found a defensible position among some large boulders and took stock of my situation. I had 2.5 magazines left for my M4, no water, no working radio, and no idea where I was in relation to friendly forces. The sun would be setting in about 6 hours, which meant I had to survive that long in temperatures that could kill me even without enemy action. But I was alive, and that was more than I could say for the insurgents I'd left behind in the village. The training was starting to kick in now, overriding the panic and fear that had driven me through those first desperate minutes. Survival school had taught me that the human body could endure incredible hardships if the mind stayed focused and disciplined. I just had to break this down into manageable problems and solve them one at a time. Water was the most immediate concern. Without it, I'd be dead from heat stroke within hours, regardless of what the enemy did. I started looking for any signs of moisture in the landscape around me. There were no obvious water sources, but I remembered something from training about finding water in desert environments. Sometimes, if you dug in the lowest point of a dry creek bed, you could find groundwater just below the surface. I found a spot where the wadi made a sharp bend, creating a natural collection point for any runoff. Using my combat knife and bare hands, I started digging into the sand and gravel. The work was exhausting in the heat, and every shovelful of dirt felt like it was sapping more strength from my already depleted reserves. But after about 20 minutes of digging, I felt the sand at the bottom of my hole getting damp. Another 10 minutes of careful excavation, and muddy water began seeping into the depression I'd created. It was brown and probably contaminated with everything from animal waste to agricultural runoff, but it was water. I let it settle for a few minutes, then used my t-shirt as a crude filter, soaking it in the muddy liquid and wringing it into my mouth. It tasted like dirt and chemicals, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced. I drank as much as I could hold, then soaked my shirt and wrapped it around my head to provide some protection from the sun. The wet fabric felt incredible against my overheated skin, and I could almost feel my body temperature starting to drop back towards something approaching normal. With the immediate water crisis addressed, I turned my attention to the tactical situation. I needed to figure out where I was and how to get back to friendly territory. The sun was my best navigation tool, and based on its position, I estimated that I was somewhere southwest of the village where the ambush had occurred. That meant our vehicles were probably somewhere to the northeast, assuming they hadn't already pulled back to base after losing contact with our patrol. I climbed to the top of the highest boulder in my position and used my rifle scope to scan the surrounding terrain. The magnification wasn't great, but it was better than trying to spot movement with the naked eye in this heat haze. To the north, I could see dust clouds that suggested vehicle movement, but I couldn't tell if they were friendly or hostile forces. To the east, there was a larger dust cloud that looked like it might be a convoy, but again, no way to identify it from this distance. What worried me most was the silence. If Martinez and the rest of the squad were looking for me, I should be hearing helicopters by now. The fact that the sky was empty suggested either that they didn't know I was missing yet, or that the tactical situation was too dangerous for a search and rescue operation. Neither possibility was particularly encouraging. I decided to stay put until evening, and then try to move under cover of darkness. Moving during the day would just make me an easy target for anyone with optics, and the heat was still dangerous enough to kill me if I pushed too hard. But staying in one place for too long was also risky. If the insurgents had any kind of tracking capability, they might be able to follow my trail from the village to this position. As the afternoon wore on, I started hearing helicopters in the distance. The sound would fade in and out, sometimes seeming to get closer, sometimes moving away entirely. I wanted desperately to signal them, but I had no way of knowing if they were American birds or enemy aircraft. Afghanistan was full of old Soviet helicopters that various factions used for transport and close air support. Around 1500 hours, I heard something that made my heart race. The distinctive whop, whop, whop of American Black Hawk helicopters. The sound was unmistakable, and it was getting closer. I grabbed my signal mirror from my survival kit and started trying to flash signals toward the sound, but the aircraft never came close enough for the pilots to see my position. The helicopters made several passes over the area, following what looked like a search pattern. They were definitely looking for something, probably me, but the terrain was too broken and my position too well concealed for them to spot me from the air. After about an hour, the sound faded away entirely, and I was alone again with the heat and the silence. That's when the real psychological battle began. Up until that point, I'd been too busy surviving to think about anything else. But now, sitting in the shade of those boulders with nothing to do but wait for darkness, my mind started working against me. I began thinking about all the ways this could end badly. I thought about Sarah getting a visit from uniformed officers who would tell her I was missing in action. I thought about my parents watching the news and wondering if their son was coming home in a box. The worst part was the uncertainty. If I'd been wounded or pinned down with my squad, at least I'd know that people were coming for me, but being completely cut off, with no communications and no way to signal my location, meant that I might as well have vanished from the face of the earth. For all anyone knew, I could already be dead, captured, or halfway to Pakistan in the back of a pickup truck. I tried to push those thoughts away by focusing on practical matters. I checked and rechecked my equipment, cleaned my rifle as best I could with the limited resources available, and planned my route for the night movement. But the doubts kept creeping back in, whispering that I was just delaying the inevitable, that I was going to die alone in this God-forsaken desert without ever seeing home again. As the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, the temperature finally began to drop. It was still brutally hot, but at least it was no longer getting worse. I used the last hour of daylight to study the terrain ahead, memorizing landmarks and identifying potential hazards. Night movement in unfamiliar territory was dangerous enough without stumbling into a minefield or falling into a hidden ravine. Just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, I heard voices. They were distant and indistinct, but they were definitely human voices speaking in Dari. The insurgents were still looking for me, probably following my trail from the village. I couldn't tell how many there were or exactly where they were, but they sounded like they were maybe half a kilometer away and moving in my general direction. I had a choice to make. I could stay hidden and hope they passed by without finding my position, or I could start moving now and try to get ahead of them. Both options had risks. If I stayed put and they found me, I'd be trapped with limited ammunition and no escape route. But if I moved too early, I might walk into another ambush or give away my position to other enemy forces in the area. The voices were getting closer, and I could hear the sound of equipment rattling as the searchers moved through the rocky terrain. They were being methodical about it, checking every possible hiding place and calling out to each other to coordinate their search pattern. These weren't amateurs stumbling around in the dark. They knew what they were doing, and they were good at it. I made my decision: better to take my chances moving than to sit still and wait to be found. I gathered my gear as quietly as possible and started working my way deeper into the maze of rocks and ravines. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid dislodging loose stones that would clatter down the hillside and give away my position. The night air was a blessed relief after the furnace heat of the day, but it brought new challenges. Without the sun to guide me, navigation became much more difficult. I had to rely on the stars and my compass, both of which were harder to use while trying to move silently through broken terrain. The darkness that concealed me from the enemy also concealed obstacles and hazards that could break an ankle or send me tumbling into a ravine. I'd been moving for about an hour when I heard the voices again, much closer this time. They'd found my hiding place among the boulders and were now following my trail. I could hear them talking excitedly, probably discussing the signs I'd left behind: footprints in the sand, disturbed vegetation, maybe even the hole I'd dug to find water. The pursuit was getting organized now. I could hear them spreading out, probably forming a skirmish line to sweep the area systematically. They had flashlights, and I could see the beams dancing across the rocks behind me, getting closer with each passing minute. These weren't just local fighters anymore. The discipline and coordination suggested they'd been reinforced by more experienced personnel, possibly foreign advisors who understood how to conduct night operations. I picked up the pace, accepting the increased risk of making noise in exchange for putting more distance between myself and the search teams. The terrain was working against me now. The ravines that had provided concealment during the day were channeling me into predictable routes that the enemy could easily cut off. I needed to get to higher ground where I'd have more options, but that meant crossing open areas where I'd be visible to anyone with night vision equipment. The sound of diesel engines reached my ears, low and rumbling in the distance. Vehicles were moving into position, probably to establish blocking positions on the major routes out of the area. They were treating this like a military operation now, not just a search for one lost American soldier. That told me something important. Either I'd killed someone significant in that village firefight, or they believed I had intelligence that was worth a major effort to capture or eliminate. I found myself thinking about the insurgent I'd shot in the alley, the young man whose eyes had met mine for that split second before I pulled the trigger. Had he been someone's son, someone's brother? Had he joined the fight because he believed in something, or just because it was the only option available to him in a country that had known nothing but war for decades? The questions ate at me as I climbed through the rocks, but I pushed them aside. Doubt was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. The voices were spreading out behind me, and I could hear dogs barking in the distance. They'd brought tracking animals, which changed everything. I could hide from human searchers, evade their flashlights and night vision, but dogs would follow my scent trail, no matter how carefully I moved. I needed to find water, something to break the scent trail and buy myself more time. I remembered passing a larger wadi about 2 kilometers back, one that looked like it might actually have running water during the rainy season. If there was even a trickle of moisture there, it might be enough to throw off the dogs. But getting there would mean doubling back toward the search teams, essentially moving toward the enemy instead of away from them. It was a calculated risk, but the alternative was being run down like an animal within the next few hours. I changed direction, using a rocky ridge to mask my movement as I worked my way back toward the wadi. The dogs were getting closer, their barking more excited as they picked up my trail. I had maybe 30 minutes before they reached my current position. The wadi was deeper than I'd expected, with steep banks that dropped about 15 feet to a sandy bottom. More importantly, there was water. Not much, just a thin stream, maybe 6 inches wide. But it was flowing water that would carry my scent downstream and confuse the tracking dogs. I slid down the bank as quietly as possible and started following the stream toward what I hoped was friendly territory. Walking in the water was treacherous in the darkness. The bottom was uneven, full of rocks and holes that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. But it was also the best chance I had of breaking contact with the pursuit. I stayed in the stream for almost 2 hours, following its meandering course through the desert landscape. When I finally climbed out of the wadi, the voices behind me had faded to nothing. Either I'd lost them, or they'd given up the search until daylight. The dogs had gone quiet too, which suggested that my water trick had worked, but I knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Come morning, they'd pick up the trail again, and next time they might bring helicopters and thermal imaging equipment that would make hiding much more difficult. I was exhausted now, running on adrenaline and willpower alone. My legs felt like rubber, and every muscle in my body ached from the constant tension and exertion. The water I'd found earlier was long gone, sweated out during the night movement, and dehydration was becoming a factor again. I needed to find shelter and rest before I collapsed from exhaustion. The landscape ahead was changing, becoming more broken and mountainous. That was good news and bad news. The terrain would provide better concealment and more defensive positions, but it would also slow my movement and make it harder to navigate. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of lights that might be a town or military base, but it was impossible to tell if it was friendly or hostile territory. I found a defensible position among some large rocks and settled in to wait for dawn. The temperature was dropping fast now, and I was starting to shiver despite the exertion of the night movement. Desert nights could be brutally cold, especially when you were dehydrated and exhausted. I wrapped myself in my poncho liner and tried to get some rest, but sleep was impossible. Every sound, every shift in the wind could signal the approach of enemy forces. As the first grey light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, I heard something that made my heart stop. The distinctive whine of turbine engines spooling up. Helicopters were launching from somewhere nearby, probably beginning the morning search for my position. I used my rifle scope to scan the sky and spotted them almost immediately. 2 aircraft flying a search pattern about 5 kilometers to the north. But these weren't the Black Hawks I'd heard yesterday. The silhouette was wrong, and they were flying too low and too aggressively for a search and rescue mission. These were attack helicopters, probably Russian-made Hinds that the insurgents had acquired from somewhere. They were hunting me with military aircraft now, which meant this had escalated far beyond a simple manhunt. I pressed myself deeper into the rocks and tried to make myself invisible. The helicopters were working a grid pattern, flying low and slow over every possible hiding place. They had door gunners, and I could see the barrels of heavy machine guns protruding from the aircraft. If they spotted me, I'd be dead in seconds. One of the helicopters passed directly overhead, so close I could see the pilot's helmet through the cockpit glass. The rotor wash kicked up a cloud of dust and debris that stung my eyes and filled my mouth with grit. I held my breath and didn't move a muscle until the aircraft had passed, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they found me. That's when I heard it. The sound of American jets high overhead, F-16s, probably launched from Bagram or one of the other major bases. The insurgent helicopters heard them too and immediately changed course, heading back toward whatever hole they'd crawled out of. Enemy aircraft couldn't operate in the same airspace as American fighters, not if they wanted to survive. The jets made several passes over the area, probably conducting reconnaissance and looking for targets of opportunity. I tried to signal them with my mirror, but they were too high and moving too fast to see anything as small as a single person on the ground. Still, their presence meant that someone knew I was missing and was actively looking for me. As the morning wore on, the heat began building again. I was down to my last few sips of muddy water, and my lips were already starting to crack from dehydration. The psychological pressure was getting worse too. I'd been alone for almost 24 hours now, cut off from all human contact except for the people who wanted to kill me. The isolation was starting to play tricks with my mind, making me hear voices and see movement where there was nothing but rocks and sand. I forced myself to focus on immediate priorities. Water was critical, but so was finding a way to signal friendly forces. I had signal flares in my survival kit, but using them would also reveal my position to any enemy forces in the area. It was a gamble that could either save my life or end it, depending on who saw the signal first. The decision was made for me when I heard vehicles approaching from the east. Diesel engines, multiple vehicles, moving fast across the desert floor. I used my scope to get a better look and felt my heart sink. They were pickup trucks, probably Toyota Hiluxes, loaded with armed men. The insurgents had brought in reinforcements and were conducting a systematic search of the entire area. There were at least 6 vehicles that I could see, each carrying 4 or 5 fighters. They were spreading out to cover more ground, and their search pattern was bringing them directly toward my position. I had maybe an hour before they reached the rocks where I was hiding, and there was nowhere else to go. The terrain behind me was open desert that offered no concealment, and the mountains ahead were too far away to reach before being spotted. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of waiting for them to find me, I was going to take the fight to them on my terms. I positioned myself among the rocks with clear fields of fire toward the most likely approach routes. My ammunition was critically low, but I still had 2 fragmentation grenades and the element of surprise. If I was going to die in this godforsaken desert, I was going to take as many of them with me as possible. The first vehicle came into range about 30 minutes later. It was moving slowly, with fighters dismounted and walking alongside, searching every possible hiding place. I let them get within 100 meters before I opened fire. My first shots took down 2 of the dismounted fighters, and my grenade landed right next to their truck, disabling the vehicle and scattering the survivors. The other vehicles immediately responded, converging on my position and laying down suppressive fire that chipped away at the rocks around me. But I'd chosen my position well, and their return fire was mostly ineffective. I managed to engage 2 more fighters before they realized they needed to coordinate their assault better. That's when everything changed. I heard a sound that was more beautiful than any symphony, the distinctive rotor signature of American helicopters approaching fast and low. 2 Apache attack helicopters came screaming over the ridge behind me, their 30mm chain guns already spinning up for action. The insurgents tried to scatter, but it was too late. The Apaches engaged with devastating precision, their Hellfire missiles turning the pickup trucks into burning scrap metal. The few fighters who survived the initial attack tried to find cover among the rocks, but the helicopter's thermal imaging systems tracked them relentlessly. I popped a signal flare to identify my position to the friendly aircraft, and within minutes I heard the approach of a Black Hawk helicopter coming in for extraction. The crew chief was already on the radio, coordinating with ground forces to secure the landing zone. As the helicopter settled into a hover above my position, a medic rappelled down to check my condition. I was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and had multiple minor injuries from the explosions and debris, but I was alive. The medic started an IV immediately and helped me into the rescue harness. The flight back to base was a blur of medical treatment and radio chatter. I learned that my squad had been searching for me since the ambush, and that Rodriguez had managed to call in my last known position before losing contact. The Quick Reaction Force had been looking for me for over 18 hours, coordinating with air assets and intelligence units to track down my location. The debriefing took days. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything about the insurgent forces I'd encountered, their equipment, their tactics, and their apparent coordination with outside elements. The fact that they'd brought in helicopters and conducted such an organized search suggested a level of capability that had surprised everyone, but the physical recovery was nothing compared to the psychological impact. I'd killed people, watched friends die, and spent 36 hours believing I might never see home again. The nightmares started almost immediately. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the sound of that RPG cutting through the air, seeing the face of that young insurgent in the alley. The army doctors diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder and recommended counseling, but I resisted at first. I was a soldier, trained to handle combat stress, and admitting I needed help felt like admitting weakness. It took months before I realized that seeking treatment wasn't about weakness. It was about healing and moving forward with my life. My deployment ended 3 months later, and I returned to Fort Bragg to complete my service obligation. But I was a different person than the young soldier who'd deployed to Afghanistan, full of confidence and naive ideas about war. I'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done, despite being terrified. I'd learned that survival sometimes comes down to luck as much as skill, and that the line between life and death can be measured in seconds and inches. The transition back to civilian life was harder than I'd expected. Simple things like going to the grocery store or sitting in a restaurant became exercises in hypervigilance. I'd position myself where I could see all the exits, scan faces for potential threats, and jump at unexpected sounds. Sarah tried to understand, but how do you explain to someone who's never been in combat what it feels like to have your nervous system permanently stuck in survival mode? I used my GI Bill benefits to go to college, studying psychology with a focus on trauma counseling. I wanted to understand what had happened to me and help other veterans who were struggling with similar issues. The academic work was challenging but therapeutic, giving me a framework for understanding my own experiences and the tools to help others process theirs. During my junior year, I started volunteering at a local veterans center, facilitating support groups for combat veterans dealing with PTSD. It was there that I met other soldiers who'd had experiences similar to mine, men and women who'd faced life and death situations and carried the psychological scars long after their physical wounds had healed. One of those veterans was a Marine named Jackson, who'd been trapped behind enemy lines in Iraq for 4 days. Another was an Air Force medic named Williams, who'd survived a helicopter crash in Afghanistan and spent 2 weeks evading capture in the mountains. Their stories were different from mine, but the core experience was the same. Ordinary people pushed to extraordinary limits, discovering reserves of strength and determination they never knew they possessed. Through these conversations, I began to understand that my experience in Afghanistan wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. The young man who'd gone to war believing he knew what courage meant had been replaced by someone who understood that real courage is messy, complicated, and often indistinguishable from terror. The soldier who'd thought war was about heroes and villains had learned that it's mostly about ordinary people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. I graduated with honors and went on to earn a master's degree in clinical psychology. Today, I work as a counselor specializing in combat trauma, helping veterans process their experiences and find ways to integrate their military service with their civilian lives. It's challenging work, but it's also incredibly rewarding. Every veteran I help represents a victory over the darkness that tried to consume me in that Afghan desert. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still hear that RPG whistling through the air when I'm stressed or overtired. But I've learned to manage these symptoms, to recognize them as normal responses to abnormal experiences. More importantly, I've learned to use my story as a source of strength rather than shame. The young insurgent I killed in that alley haunts me less now, though I still think about him sometimes. I've come to understand that he was probably just like me. A young man caught up in circumstances beyond his control, fighting for what he believed was right. War doesn't create heroes and villains. It creates survivors and casualties, and the difference between them often comes down to luck, training, and split-second decisions. My relationship with Sarah didn't survive my return from Afghanistan. The person who came back wasn't the same person she'd fallen in love with, and neither of us knew how to bridge that gap. But I've found love again, with a woman who understands that my scars are part of who I am, not something to be fixed or forgotten. If you're watching this and you're a veteran struggling with your own demons, I want you to know that you're not alone. The feelings you're experiencing, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the sense of being disconnected from the civilian world, these are normal responses to abnormal experiences. Seeking help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength and wisdom. And if you're not a veteran, but you know someone who is, please understand that coming home from war isn't just about physically returning to familiar places. It's about learning to live with memories and experiences that most people can't imagine. Sometimes the best thing you can do is simply listen without trying to fix or judge. The desert taught me that survival isn't just about making it through the immediate crisis. It's about finding ways to carry the weight of your experiences without being crushed by them. It's about transforming trauma into wisdom, fear into compassion, and isolation into connection. That's why I'm sharing this story with you today. Not because I want sympathy or recognition, but because I believe that our struggles, our survival, and our healing can serve as beacons for others who are fighting their own battles. Whether you're facing combat trauma, personal loss, addiction, or any other challenge that seems insurmountable, remember that human beings are capable of enduring and overcoming more than we ever imagined possible. The sound of that RPG still echoes in my head, but it no longer defines me. It's become part of a larger story about resilience, growth, and the incredible capacity of the human spirit to heal and help others heal. If my 36 hours in hell can help even one person find their way back to the light, then every moment of that terror and pain will have been worth it. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please share it with others who might need to hear it. And remember, no matter how dark your current situation might seem, you have the strength to survive it and the potential to transform it into something meaningful. The desert taught me that survival is possible, but healing and growth, that's where the real victory lies.